many evangelicals in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, who really see Israel as God's chosen people still, and a people that God has a purpose and a plan for. See, the fact is, that God gave a covenant to Abraham, and that God, in many places, even before the prophets, speaks of it as almost irrevocable and eternal. And therefore, regardless of what Israel, its hypocrisy in terms of dealing with that, and also what I think many Orthodox Jews and ultra-Orthodox Jews believe, and their complex relationship with the state of Israel. Some of them say there shouldn't be a state of Israel, not this state of Israel that is there, because it's so secular, so anti-biblical in many ways. But anyway, I mean, still, I think at the heart of the situation is this belief that Israelis have a unique and an exclusive claim to that land. Now, I know that Christians who place themselves in your point of the spectrum see it differently. How do you see it differently? And how are we able to neutralize those clear statements of Scripture in the light of your perspective?
Yeah. So again, this goes to those three things on the side of the wall, and so the theological. So what I would say is we need to be having a meaningful conversation about it. What we do is we just stay in our camps, and so the whole issue of the land and the prophetic understanding, I don't have all that worked out. I would say my eschatology.
Sure, it's a difficult thing. It's a work in progress.
Right. My eschatology has always been a little loose in this regard. But what I would say is we have to frame it honestly. Like, has it been universally true throughout church history, and even today, that people agree on their eschatological understanding? Now, we may look at it and say there's a certain leaning among evangelicals, but even among that, I think we have to be honest and say there's a variety of views that are out there. And so there are a lot of theologies that are at play in the Christian world related to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So you had, on one side, so you can kind of do it as a continuum. You would have dual covenant theology would be one example, where there are like two covenants between, one for the church and one for the Jews. So most of us in the evangelical world, we would immediately, say that's not one. But then you move to the next one, you would say is dispensational theology. And this dispensational theology is the camp where Christian Zionism tends to be very, very strong. And there are many evangelicals and Western Christians that would find themselves more in that camp. But then you have another category that is called covenant theology or fulfillment theology that says, when Jesus came, there was a certain fulfillment, that in him there was a fulfillment that made it, there was a difference. And so covenant theology is say you cannot read the Old Testament and pretend like the New Testament doesn't exist. We have to look at what Jesus thought about the land and what he taught and what the New Testament says. But actually both are true. You cannot read the New Testament without reading the Old, and you can't read the Old without reading the New. That we need to read both, and here's where a theological discourse really needs to happen.
How does that relate to, let's say, replacement theology, or what they call supersessionism?
That's right.
So what is the difference between
so I would place that in the next category, would be supersessionism or replacement theology. What I have found, though, is that for people that have a very ardent position that usually comes out of the dispensational camp and thinking, and that includes Christian Zionism, anything that isn't their position is labeled as replacement theology. In other words, if you don't agree with me, you must be a replacement theologian, and that has a very dark, sinister kind of connotation to it. So what I want to say is, there is a valid. I don't consider myself a replacement theologian, but I would say I also don't want to demonize those who sincerely hold a more mature view that would be along those lines. I would say they need to be part of the conversation. If you had to pin me down, I would place myself maybe more in the covenant theology kind of a category, but. To be honest, I don't even like to be put in a category.
What do you think would be Jesus? You mentioned Jesus' position. I'm intrigued by that. What would you say? What position would you say? Is there an opportunity to position him somewhere, given his declarations and his words and so on, where he would place himself in this whole issue of Israel and the church to come and so on, and the land?
Yeah. So to be honest, so I'm in a real steep learning curve, and I don't know that I could articulate. There are a lot of people that have given a lot of thought to this and reflection. One book that I would just recommend along this lines is Gary Burge's book, Jesus and the Land. So in that book, Burge kind of outlines that in the New Testament, Jesus really didn't have a lot to say about the land, that if this was such an important issue. So again, I don't know that I could adequately on the spot represent that.
Of course, that's the theological argument out of silence, that just because he didn't say anything, that it didn't matter to him. And of course, we know that that's not a legitimate thing. There's many things that Jesus did not mention.
That's right.
That he didn't mention it because it didn't come to the issue at the moment.
That's right. Well, of course, Burge's conversation would be much more elaborate than that. It's just that I'm not able to kind of deliver his argument at this point,
But again, what would regarding that land, what would you see as the just solution to the issue of land and the fact that Israelis say, we need to contain the Palestinians? Because again, it's also the question is it just the Palestinians? I think the Palestinian people as a whole would be seen as a noble, hardworking, friendly, people of honor, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that to speak of just the Palestinians as in themselves neglects the complexity of the issue, that you have Hamas, you have Hezbollah, you have all these other Arab nations that profit tremendously from the Palestinian issue in their desire to isolate Israel. And that ultimately almost don't seem to be very interested in real peace. They seem to be interested in the destruction of the state of Israel. They have repeatedly, at great cost, resisted the call to just acknowledge the right of this tiny nation to exist. And they have, ferociously denied that at great cost to their cause. And so, part of the problem is that you have these other elements in there, as they are physically. You have these terrorists inside these neighborhoods, inside these houses, where there are innocent civilians that are being manipulated by them in so many different ways. And so it's not clear who are you talking about and who are you talking with and whose rights is one espousing. So, sometimes it's like almost you have to talk about Palestinians / Hezbollah / Hamas / Syria and so on and so forth. And so it's really hard to kind of just extract one piece of it. And I think that's a problem. So that when you're saying, okay, the Palestinians have a right to that land, but you're also saying, you're also giving the right for Hamas, who was taking over, and Hezbollah, to continue existing and doing all the damage that they're doing to the Israeli society. So I think that's one of the problems that Israelis would say. And Christians also were concerned about Israel. Say, hey, what are we talking about here? Is it just Palestine, or is it so much more? That whole complexity of circles that you spoke about. It's not just that tiny little thing at the center. All the other players who are cajoling and moving and jockeying for position as well.